Good evening and welcome back to another episode of The Longing. Today we are going to be continuing to read The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett, and I'm not feeling particularly well, so if I sound a bit worse for wear, I'm a little bit worse for wear, but we'll be fine. So, let's continue. Go and make one of the men servants bring me some in a basket to the rhododendron walk, he said, and then you and Dickon can bring it here. It was an agreeable idea, easily carried out, and when the white cloth was spread upon the grass, with hot tea and buttered toast and crumpets, a delightfully hungry meal was eaten, and several birds on domestic errands paused to inquire what was going on, and were led into investigating crumbs with great activity. Nut and Shell whisked up trees with pieces of cake, and Soot took the entire half of a buttered crumpet into a corner, and pecked it and examined and turned it over and made hoarse remarks about it until he decided to swallow it, all joyfully in one gulp. The afternoon was dragging towards its mellow hour. The sun was deepening the gold of its lances. The bees were going home, and the birds were flying past less often. Dickon and Mary were sitting on the grass, the tea blanket was repacked, ready to be taken back to the house, and Colin was lying against his cushions, with his heavy locks pushed back from his forehead, and his face looking quite a natural colour. "I don't want this afternoon to go," he said, "but I shall come back tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after, and the day after." "You'll get plenty of fresh air, won't you?" said Mary. "I'm going to get nothing else," he answered. "I've seen the spring now, and I'm going to see the summer. I'm going to see everything grow here. I'm going to grow here myself." "That there will," said Dickon. "Us'll have thee walking about here and digging same as other folk afore long." Colin flushed tremendously. "Walk," he said. "Dig? Shall I?" Dickon's glance at him was delicately cautious. Neither he nor Mary had ever asked if anything was the matter with his legs. "For sure there will," he said stoutly. There's got legs of thine own, same as other folks." Mary was rather frightened until she heard Colin's answer. "Nothing really ails them," he said, "but they are so thin and weak. They shake so that I'm afraid to try to stand on them." Both Mary and Dickon drew a relieved breath. "When thou stops being afraid, thou'lt stand on 'em," Dickon said with renewed cheer, "and thou'lt stop being afraid in a bit." "I shall," said Colin, and he lay still as if he were wondering about things. They were really very quiet for a little while. The sun was dropping lower. It was that hour when everything stills itself, and they really had had a busy and exciting afternoon. Colin looked as if he were resting luxuriously. Even the creatures had ceased moving about, and had drawn together and were resting near them. Soot had perched on a low branch and drawn up one leg, and dropped the grey film drowsily over his eyes. Mary privately thought he looked as if he might snore in a minute. In the midst of this stillness, it was rather startling when Colin half lifted his head and exclaimed in a loud, suddenly alarmed whisper. "Who is that man?" Dickon and Mary scrambled to their feet. "Man?" they both cried in low, quick voices. Colin pointed to the high wall. "Look," he whispered excitedly. "Just look." Mary and Dickon wheeled about and looked. There was Ben Weatherstaff's indignant face glaring at them over the wall from the top of a ladder. He actually shook his fist at Mary. "If I wasn't a Pachelder, and thou was a wench o' mine," he cried, "I'd give thee a hidin'." He mounted another step threateningly, as if it were his energetic intention to jump down and deal with her. But as she came toward him, he evidently thought better of it, and stood on the top step of his ladder, shaking his fist down at her. "I never thought much of thee," he harangued. "I couldn't abide thee the first time I set eyes on thee. A scrawny, buttermilk-faced young bisom, allus asking questions and poking the nose where it wasna wanted. I never knowed how they got so thick wi' me. If it hadna been for the robin, drat him." "Ben Weatherstaff," called out Mary, finding her breath. She stood below him and called up to him with a sort of gasp. "Ben Weatherstaff, it was the robin who showed me the way." Then it really did seem as if Ben really would scramble down on her side of the wall. He was so outraged. "That young bad un," he called down at her, "laying the badness on a Robin. Not but what he's impudent enough for anything. He's showing the way. Him? Eh? The young note." She could see his next words burst out because he was overpowered by curiosity. "However in this world did they get in?" "It was the Robin who showed me the way," she protested obstinately. "He didn't know he was doing it, but he did. And I can't tell you from here while you're shaking your fist at me." He stopped shaking his fist very suddenly, at that very moment, and his jaw actually dropped as he stared over her head at something he saw coming over the grass toward him. At the first sound of his torrent of words, Colin had been so surprised that he had only sat up and listened as if he were spellbound. But, in the midst of it, he had recovered himself and beckoned imperiously to Dickon. "Wheel me over there," he commanded. "Wheel me quite close and stop right in front of him." And this, if you please, this is what Ben Weatherstaff beheld, and which made his jaw drop. A wheeled chair with luxurious cushions and robes, which came toward him, looking rather like some sort of stage-coach, because a young Rajah leaned back in it with royal command in his great black-rimmed eyes, and a thin white hand extended haughtily toward him. And it stopped right under Ben Weatherstaff's nose. It was really no wonder his mouth dropped open. "Do you know who I am?" demanded the Rajah. How Ben Weatherstaff stared. His red old eyes fixed themselves on what was before him, as if he were seeing a ghost. He gazed and gulped a lump down his throat, and did not say a word. "Do you know who I am?" demanded Colin, still more imperiously. "Answer." Ben Weatherstaff put his gnarled hand up, and passed it over his eyes and over his forehead, and then he did answer in a queer, shaky voice. "Who thou art," he said. "Aye, that I do, with a mother's eyes staring at me out of that face. Lord knows how they come here, but thou art the poor cripple." Colin forgot that he had ever had a back. His face flushed scarlet, and he sat bolt upright. "I'm not a cripple," he cried out furiously. "I'm not." "He's not," cried Mary, almost shouting up the wall in her fierce indignation. "He's not got a lump as big as a pin. I looked and there was none there, not one." Ben Weatherstaff passed his hand over his forehead again and gazed as if he could never gaze enough. His hand shook and his mouth shook, and his voice shook. He was an ignorant old man and a tactless old man, and he could only remember the things he had heard. There hasn't got a crooked back," he said hoarsely. "No," shouted Colin. There hasn't got crooked legs," quavered Ben more hoarsely yet. It was too much. The strength which Colin usually threw into his tantrums rushed through him now in a new way. Never yet had he been accused of crooked legs, even in whispers, and the perfectly simple belief in their existence which was revealed by Ben Weatherstaff's voice was more than Rajah's flesh and blood could endure. His anger and insulted pride made him forget everything but this one moment, and filled him with a power he had never known before, an almost unnatural strength. "Come here," he shouted to Dickon, and he actually began to tear the coverings off his lower limbs and disentangle himself. Come here this minute." Dickon was by his side in a second. Mary caught her breath in a short gasp, and felt herself turn pale. He can do it, he can do it, he can do it, he can," she gabbled over to him herself under her breath as fast as ever she could. There was a brief, fierce scramble. The rugs were tossed on the ground. Dickon held Colin's arm. The thin legs were out. The thin feet were on the grass. Colin was standing upright, as straight as an arrow, and looking strangely tall. His head thrown back, and his strange eyes flashing lightning. "Look at me," he flung up at Ben Weatherstaff. "Just look at me. You just look at me." And with that, we come to the end of the episode. So I will say thank you very much for joining me. I hope you all have a wonderful morning, evening, afternoon or night, no matter what time of day it is. I hope you have a wonderful one of it. And as always, we will be back tomorrow for more of The Longing. Goodbye.